During its imperial era, the Empire of Japan committed countless war crimes and crimes against humanity across various Asia-Pacific nations, especially during the Second Sino-Japanese War and the Pacific War. These incidents have been referred to as the Asian Holocaust. Most of these crimes occurred during the early part of the Showa era, under the reign of Hirohito. The Imperial Japanese Army, IJA, and the Imperial Japanese Navy, IJN, were responsible for a series of war crimes that resulted in millions of deaths. These crimes ranged from sexual slavery and massacres to human experimentation, starvation, and forced labor, all directly committed or tolerated by the Japanese government and military. Evidence of these crimes, including verbal testimonies and written records such as diaries and war journals, was provided by Japanese veterans. The Imperial Japanese Army Air Service participated in chemical and biological attacks against civilians during the Second Sino-Japanese War and World War II, in violation of international agreements that Japan had previously signed, including the Hague Conventions, which prohibited the use of poisonous weapons in warfare. Since the 1950s, numerous apologies for war crimes have been issued by high-ranking Japanese government officials. Japan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs acknowledged the country's role in causing tremendous damage and suffering during World War II, particularly the massacre and rape of civilians in Nanking. However, the issue remains controversial, with some members of the Japanese government, including former Prime Ministers Junichiro Koizumi and Shinzo Abe, paying respects at the Yasukuni Shrine, which honors all Japanese war dead, including convicted Class A war criminals. Additionally, some Japanese history textbooks provide only brief references to war crimes, and certain members of the Liberal Democratic Party have denied some of the atrocities, such as the government's involvement in the abduction of women to serve as comfort women. Get ready, because today you will see all the atrocities that Japan committed during the first half of the last century. Japanese military culture. Japanese military culture played a significant role during Japan's imperialist period, especially before and during World War II. World War II. Over previous centuries, Japanese samurai were taught to strictly obey their lords and to show unwavering courage in battle. After the Meiji Restoration and the fall of the Tokugawa shogunate, military loyalty became directed toward the emperor. During the so-called imperial period in the late 19th century, Japan actively sought to expand its empire, following the example of other world powers. Like other imperialist nations, Japanese popular culture became increasingly nationalistic from the late 19th to the 20th century. This nationalism was driven in part by the adoption of Shinto as the official religion in 1890, which was integrated into the education system. Shinto considered the emperor a divine figure, descended from the sun goddess Amaterasu, thus justifying absolute obedience to the emperor and his representatives. Victory in the First Sino-Japanese War in 1894–95 elevated Japan to the status of a major military power. However, the country did not sign the Geneva Convention until the end of World War II, although an imperial proclamation in 1894 required Japanese soldiers to respect international laws. During this conflict, Japanese forces released 1,790 Chinese prisoners who promised not to fight Japan again. After the Russo-Japanese War of 1904–05, all 79,367 prisoners from the Russian Empire were released and compensated for their labor, in accordance with the Hague Convention. The behavior of Japanese military personnel during World War I was considered as humane as that of other countries involved in the conflict. Because of the sheer scale of suffering inflicted by the Japanese military during the 1930s and 1940s, they are frequently compared to the military forces of Nazi Germany during the 1933 to 1945 period. Much of the controversy surrounding Japan's role in World War II revolves around the mortality rates of prisoners of war and civilians under Japanese occupation. Historian Chalmers Johnson wrote, "It may be pointless to try to establish which of the two Axis aggressors in World War II, Germany or Japan, was more brutal to the people they victimized. The Germans killed 6 million Jews and 20 million Russians. The Japanese murdered around 30 million Filipinos, Malays, Vietnamese, Cambodians, Indonesians, and Burmese, and at least 23 million ethnic Chinese. Both nations looted the countries they conquered on a monumental scale, although the Japanese plundered more and for a longer period than the Nazis. Both enslaved millions and exploited them as forced laborers, and in the case of the Japanese, as sexual workers for frontline troops. If you were a British, American, Australian, New Zealander, or Canadian prisoner of war held by the Nazis, you had a 4% chance of dying before the end of the war. Comparatively, the mortality rate for Allied prisoners of war held by the Japanese was nearly 30%. The mortality rate for Chinese prisoners of war was much higher because, under a directive ratified on August 5, 1937, by Emperor Hirohito, the restrictions of international law regarding the treatment of those prisoners were lifted. Only 56 Chinese prisoners of war were released after Japan's surrender. In the Pacific and Asian theaters, Allied soldiers faced a cruel disregard for civilized norms, similar to the treatment directed at Japanese soldiers. This inadequate treatment extended to prisoners of war, among other issues. Kingston, referring to this phenomenon, highlighted the observations of documentary filmmakers Jonathan Lewis and Ben Steele, who argued that the perception that the war was characterized solely by Japanese brutality was being challenged by a growing body of evidence regarding brutalities committed by the Allies. Rather than comparing which side was worse, the real question lay in understanding whether they shared more similarities than had been previously imagined. During World War II, special Japanese military units conducted horrific experiments on civilians and prisoners of war in China. Among them, the most infamous was Unit 731. In these inhumane experiments, victims were subjected to amputations and vivisection without anesthesia. They were also used for testing biological weapons and other cruel experiments. Anesthesia was deliberately avoided because it was believed that its use could interfere with the experimental results. In some cases, even animal blood was injected into the bodies of the victims. One of the most shocking cases of human experimentation occurred in Japan itself. After the crash of a B-29 bomber from the United States Army Air Forces in Kyushu on May 5, 1945, 9 of the 12 crew members survived. The commander was sent to Tokyo for interrogation, while the other survivors were taken to Kyushu University in Fukuoka, where they were subjected to vivisection or killed. On March 11, 1948, 30 people, including several doctors, were brought to trial for war crimes. Although the charges of cannibalism were dismissed, 23 individuals were found guilty of vivisection and/or illegal removal of body parts. 5 were sentenced to death, 4 to life imprisonment, and the rest to lesser sentences. However, in 1950, General Douglas MacArthur, the military governor of Japan at the time, commuted all death sentences and significantly reduced the prison sentences. All those convicted in connection with the vivisection at the university were released by 1958. Historical records indicate that Emperor Hirohito authorized the use of chemical weapons in China through specific orders. During the Battle of Wuhan, from August to October 1938, the emperor permitted the use of toxic gas on 375 different occasions, violating international conventions and resolutions of the League of Nations. This act violated Article 23 of the Hague Conventions, Article 5 of the Treaty on the Use of Submarines and Poisonous Gases in War, and a resolution from the League of Nations condemning the use of poison gas by Japan. The deaths caused by famine in countries occupied by the Japanese are considered war crimes by many. Millions of civilians in South Asia, especially in Vietnam and Indonesia, died during an avoidable famine in 1944 to 45 due to the diversion of resources to Japanese troops. Imperial Japanese forces were reported to have extensively used torture on prisoners of war, usually with the goal of quickly extracting information. The tortured prisoners were often executed afterward. Uno Shintaro, a former officer of the Imperial Japanese Army who served in China, stated that torture was considered necessary for obtaining information, frequently followed by executions to avoid discovery of the methods used. This reflected a dehumanizing view of the enemies, who were considered inferior and without rights. This dehumanization was upheld by the belief in the superiority of the Japanese race. Many Allied aviators captured by the Japanese on land or at sea were executed in accordance with official Japanese policy. During the Battle of Midway in June 1942, 3 American aviators who were shot down and landed in the sea were spotted and captured by Japanese warships. After brief interrogations, 2 aviators were killed, their bodies tied to 5-liter kerosene cans filled with water and dumped from the destroyer Makigumo. The third was killed, and his body dumped into the sea from Arashi. The Enemy Aviators Act contributed to the deaths of hundreds of Allied aviators during the Pacific War. It is estimated that 132 Allied aviators shot down during air raids on Japan in 1944 to 1945 were summarily executed after brief kangaroo trials. Imperial Japanese military personnel deliberately killed 33 American aviators in Fukuoka, including 15 who were beheaded shortly after the Japanese government's intention to surrender on August 15, 1945. Crowds of civilians also murdered several Allied aviators before Japanese military personnel arrived to take the aviators into custody. Another 94 aviators died from other causes while in Japanese custody, including 52 who were killed when they were deliberately abandoned in a prison during the bombing of Tokyo on May 24 to 25, 1945. Comfort women, or relief women, is a euphemism used to refer to women who were forced into prostitution and sexual slavery in Japanese military brothels during World War II. It is estimated that between 50,000 and 200,000 women were conscripted, although there are still disagreements about the exact numbers. Correspondence from the Imperial Japanese Army shows that the purpose of establishing comfort stations was to prevent rape crimes from being committed by Japanese military personnel, and thus avoid the emergence of hostilities among the populations of the occupied areas. Given the well-organized and open nature of prostitution in Japan, the need for organized prostitution serving the Japanese armed forces was seen as logical. In addition to supposedly preventing rapes and the transmission of venereal diseases, the comfort stations were meant to serve as a leisure for soldiers and to minimize the risk of espionage. The comfort stations, however, did not solve the first 2 problems. According to Japanese historian Yoshiaki Yoshimi, they helped worsen them. Yoshimi stated that the Imperial Japanese Army feared that the soldiers' latent discontent could explode into mutiny and revolt. That's why they provided women. Hospital ships are painted white with large red crosses to show that they are not combat ships, but vessels carrying the wounded and medical staff. Shortly after the war, the Allies indicted 25 individuals as Class A war criminals and 5,700 individuals as Class B or Class C criminals. Of these, 984 were initially sentenced to death. 920 were actually executed. 475 received life imprisonment. 2,944 received various prison sentences. 1,018 were acquitted, and 279 were not sentenced or were not tried. This total included 178 ethnic Taiwanese and 148 ethnic Koreans. The Class A charges were all tried by the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, also known as the Tokyo Trials. Other courts were established in various locations across Asia and the Pacific. Thank you very much for watching until the end. May God bless you all and see you soon.